I want to begin by telling you that Freeport Speech is really, really proud and pleased to bring an interesting series of lectures to the Greater Portland community, Freeport and the Greater Portland community. The whole idea is to listen, think, and talk to each other about very important subjects. So our first talk was Heather Cox Richardson. Tonight we have our incredible Senator Angus King. And we have one housekeeping note. We're welcoming Dr. Shah and his wife, Cara Palamountain, Professor Cara Palamountain here tonight. A slight correction, and this happened after we went to press. There's a CDC meeting on this date out of town, so Nirav and Cara and Dora Mills will be speaking in August instead of on June 29. So if you keep your catalog, remember that we're going to have a different, wonderful speaker. I have to confirm the date, so I'm not going to announce it tonight, but we'll have a press release out shortly about that. And then in July, we have a blockbuster evening with both the Defense Department and State Department views about the Ukraine being done that evening. And so we hope you'll put it on your calendars, look at our website or on Eventbrite as soon as tickets go on sale, and hope you'll join us for those. Lastly, I'd like to thank our sponsors for the evening, our lead sponsors, Ed and Jane Bradley, who really have made this all happen. Their 40 or 50-year relationship with Senator King. And then also locally owned, this is a wonderful Maine evening, our local pet pantry, Chris Parker, and who provides wonderful both food and services for your wonderful pets at your home. And Revision Energy, also locally owned, locally managed, wonderful company providing solar energy throughout the state of Maine. Our sponsors and our ticket sales make it possible for Freeport Speech. Every one of our speeches, the net proceeds go to a very worthy not-for-profit cause. And tonight it's going to this wonderful place, the Arts and Cultural Alliance of Freeport, Meetinghouse Arts, and I'm very proud to tell you that in excess of $6,000 will be going as a result of this evening to ACAF and Meetinghouse Arts. And very lastly, we have a new category. I would encourage you all to follow the leadership that has started here. Brand new category as of this week called Seasoned Supporters. And if you want to make a phone call or go on our website, we would love to have you join us as supporting this whole season of wonderful speakers. We are booked out monthly through the end of the year. So pay attention, look on Eventbrite, look on our website, look on the Meetinghouse Arts website, and you'll get announcements as the dates get confirmed. Now the easiest part of all. In the great tradition of Margaret Chase Smith, Bill Cohen, Edmund Muskie, George Mitchell, Maine is blessed to have phenomenal leadership on a national and international basis. This is the easiest introduction because I think everyone in this room knows Senator King from his years as governor, preceded by that as a major environmental activist in the state of Maine, and his incredible record in Washington, D.C., and his true leadership. I don't think I have to say any more. You'd rather hear him than me. Thank you very much, Senator Angus King. Thank you. Great to be with you. Thank you.
must be a slow night in Freeport, that's all I can say. I'm just delighted to be here, but I got to tell you, it's a little daunting to follow Heather Cox Richardson. I just ran, I'm not making this up, about 2 weeks ago, I ran across a little thing on social media that said, I wish my parents loved me as much as they love Heather Cox Richardson. I mean, seriously. And I got to tell some stories about Ed. Ed and Jane and I go back, what, 50 years, almost, 45, 50 years. And to show you how smart we are, I don't know if you remember this, Ed, we literally sat in my kitchen in Topsom in about 1977 or 78 and said, how can we make money off the fact that all these people come to LL Bean's, and never thought of buying any real estate around it. I mean, how did we miss that? You remember? I mean, it just, now he did buy waterfront property though. He was a little smarter than I was. Okay, what I want to do tonight is talk about the Senate, and the speech goes like this: 10 things that might surprise you about the U.S. Senate. And the nice thing about this is you'll know exactly where we are in the speech. You see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then we'll have questions and can talk about whatever you wish. I'm not going to be talking too much about current events, but clearly, if we want to talk about those later, we certainly can. The first thing is, number one, we don't hate each other. All the press is, you know, toxic atmosphere in Washington, and Chuck Schumer and Mitch McConnell and all those kinds of things. And the truth is, we get along pretty well, personally, individually, but not necessarily institutionally. Now, you know, there are some tough feelings. I don't know if any of you saw Al Franken down in Portland a couple of months ago. Al's funniest line of the night was, I like Ted Cruz a lot better than most of my colleagues, and I hate Ted Cruz. That was... Ted and I came in together in 2013, and so we've managed to maintain a pretty, you know, decent relationship. We don't agree on very much, but, you know, we chat back and forth. And one day, I was talking with him on the floor during a vote. If you watch a vote on C-SPAN of the Senate, if you're having trouble sleeping or, you know, but if you watch the vote, what you'll see is a lot of milling around. It looks like the dump on Saturday morning, you know? People are chatting and going to... So one day, I was chatting and talking to Ted, and we were walking by, and I walked off the floor, and my phone rang, and it was Mary. She said, what are you doing talking to Ted Cruz? I said, what, do you have a drone? What is this? But it's true that we do have relationships. However, one of the real problems is we don't know each other. We don't know each other. This is number two. The Senate schedule has really screwed the place up. I worked there in the 70s for Bill Hathaway in the early 70s during the Watergate period as a staff member, it's really fun to come back 40 years later. In fact, I was sworn in as a U.S. Senator 40 years to the day that I entered Senate service as a staff member in January of 1973. In those days, the senators lived in Washington. Their families were there. Ed Muskie lived in Chevy Chase. Bill Hathaway lived in McLean. Bill Cohen lived somewhere, I think in Bethesda or something like that. But their families were there. Their kids were there. They went to school together. They were there on weekends. They hung out. They had potluck dinners and commuted and all those kinds of things. Today, here's the way the Senate schedule works. The first vote that you have to be there is Monday afternoon at about 5:30. The last vote that you have to be there for is Thursday afternoon at about 1:30. So what happens? Everybody goes to the airport Thursday afternoon, and they're home Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday morning. People have said, why doesn't Mary come to Washington? Well, actually, Mary says, I'll come to Washington when something special's going on. Doesn't include me. I don't know. But seriously, there wouldn't be much point in Mary coming to Washington. I'm there 3 nights and I'm here 4. And the times I'm here, I'm working till 8 or 9 at night. So, but here's the point. We don't know each other because everybody goes home. Brian Schatz, the senator from Hawaii, goes home every weekend to Hawaii. People from Oregon, Washington, Alaska, Dan Sullivan from Alaska goes home every weekend. I come home. For me, it's a piece of cake. It's an hour and 20-minute flight from Washington to Portland. That's easy. But anyway, when everybody goes home and their families are back home in wherever they are, South Dakota or Illinois or wherever, there are no relationships. And if you don't have, and this explains, I believe, part of the reason the Senate doesn't work very well. If you don't know people and have a relationship with them, how the hell are you supposed to work out a difficult problem? Because working out a compromise involves trust. And trust involves a pre-existing relationship. When I used to teach over at Bowdoin, I said you have to put trust in the bank. You have to put trust in the bank before you have to make a withdrawal, but there's no putting it in the bank because we just don't, there aren't social relationships. My favorite hour of the week at the Senate is the Wednesday morning prayer breakfast. The reason is, number one, it's a quiet hour in the midst of all the craziness. Secondly, it's the only bipartisan event of the week, other than official, committee meetings where everybody's sitting on different sides of the hall. It's the only time of the week where both parties are sitting around in not with a partisan agenda. And then the third reason I like it is that each week, it's no press, no staff, only senators and former senators, and each week we have a different senator who speaks. And they are supposed to, theoretically, ostensibly it's about your faith, but it always ends up being autobiographical. And it's fascinating to learn these folks' history of where they came from, who their parents were, how they grew up, on a farm, or, Lindsey Graham grew up above a bar and pool room in South Carolina. And his parents died when he was like 19 or 20 years old. He raised his younger sister. And you learn, you start to learn a little bit about your colleagues, and that makes it, as I say, my favorite hour of the week. Now, I was there about a year, and I realized this. And I realized how I tried to think, why does it not work as well as it did in the 70s? They're smart people, and good people. What's the matter? And I struck upon this schedule problem and the fact that we didn't have any time together. By the way, you think, well, how about lunch? No. The Democrats have an official caucus lunch on Tuesday, so do the Republicans. The Democrats have an official caucus lunch on Thursday, so do the Republicans. The Republicans have an official lunch on Wednesday. The Democrats go crazy and let you go have a lunch, somewhere else. But even lunch is apart. And so Mary and I bought a little house about 8 blocks from the Capitol. When I say little, 908 square feet. Although a Washington newspaper wrote a story about what I'm about to tell you, and they said it was 9,080 square feet. I said, oh, God, don't let that get to the Bangor Daily News. So anyway, 2 blocks from our house is Kenny's Smokehouse, a pretty good rib joint. So about every 6 weeks, and we just started last week, but we got blown up by late-night votes, but before COVID, about every 6 weeks, Claire Briggio from my office, who's my scheduler, her dad is Bill Briggio, who's a longtime city manager of Augusta. Some of you probably know him. Anyway, Claire would call around to the Senate offices and scare up about 5 or 6 senators, always bipartisan, to come over for ribs. And on the way home, the caterer was me going to Kenny's and picking up 2 racks of ribs, beans, and coleslaw. Peaches at Kenny's knows me. I call, she says, yes, sir, Mr. King, the regular order tonight? And all it is talking, just getting to know each other. For example, I mentioned Ted Cruz. By the way, I've had probably 55 or 60 of the 100 senators. I've had Mitch McConnell, Chuck Schumer, Elizabeth Warren, Cory Booker, Ted Cruz, not all on the same night. but it is bipartisan. But anyway, we were having dinner, and Ted was with us, and he looked at his watch. It was 8 o'clock. He said, Angus, you mind if I go upstairs and make a phone call? I said, no, fine. So he went upstairs, make a phone call, came back down. Turns out every night at 8 o'clock, wherever he is, he calls his children. That's something you don't learn about Ted Cruz on CNN. And it was just a little human thing that I thought was important. And so these dinners, and at one dinner, imagine you guys are two senators, they were sitting, two of my colleagues were sitting next to each other, and one of them looked up at me and said, Angus, I've seen this guy around here for 8 years, and this is the first time we've talked. Isn't that appalling? Does that explain a little bit about the Senate and how it works? The only trouble with putting your notes on your phone is that you have to open it up every time. A corollary to we don't hate each other is we do occasionally get things done on a bipartisan basis, but it doesn't get much attention. Ed said, are you going to scare us tonight? I said, no, I'm going to reassure you a little bit. We got the biggest infrastructure bill since the interstate highway system on a bipartisan basis. We had the Great American Outdoors Act about a year and a half ago, the biggest land conservation bill in 50 years, 70 votes in the Senate. We did a budget this year. Amazing. It was 5 months late, but look, but it was also done on a bipartisan basis. So occasionally these things get done. The problem is, and I used to do Maine Watch. I always liked controversy. It's more fun, it's more interesting. Controversy sells cable news subscribers and newspapers. Boring old working together doesn't get, it goes to page 4. So I'm reporting to you that in many ways it's not as bad as it looks. In some ways it's worse, but that's another point. Okay, talked about scheduled week relationships, rigged dinners. Here's the way it's worse than it looks. The minority runs the place in many ways. And when I say that, the minority I'm talking about is the country. The Senate is a very peculiar institution. If the Senate wasn't in the Constitution, it would be unconstitutional. Literally. One man, one vote. That's the principle. There were legal cases in the 50s and 60s. That was the one person, one vote was the standard. Well, hell, California has 2 senators and Maine has 2. And Wyoming has 2. So the Senate starts off malapportioned. I haven't done the calculation recently, but the last time I did it, 20 US senators represent a majority of Americans. That means 80 represent the other half. Now, that doesn't square with democratic theory very well. So think of that for a minute. 20 senators represent a majority of the American people. 80 represent the other majority minus 1. Then you layer on top of that the filibuster, which requires 60 votes. And I did do the math on this fairly recently. You can block anything in the US Senate with senators representing 24% of the American population. That means 76% of the American population can be stopped. Now that doesn't square with democratic theory very well either. So you take the malapportionment of the Senate as it was established by the framers, and by the way, I'm not saying that's a bad idea, but then you put on top of that the incrustation of the filibuster, and you really see the power of the minority, particularly rural states, small states like Maine. And the Senate was a compromise. The thing that almost broke the Constitutional Convention was representation in the Congress. The larger states wanted it to be by population. The smaller states were afraid that they would just be swamped. So the so-called Great Compromise was the invention of the Senate, which is every state has 2 seats. I will share with you, he said modestly, the quality of the senators does not have anything to do with the size of the state. I noticed that as governor, too. So, yeah, my notes say, minority control is worse than it looks, but Maine. Now, filibuster. Fixing the filibuster is harder than it looks. And it's easy to say, let's get rid of it. By golly, let's get rid of it. We can pass Biden's agenda. We can do gun control, and we can do abortion rights and all of those things. And I came to the Senate, I have to admit, I came to the Senate primed to do just that. And I can make all the arguments, as I'm sure you can and do and will, that it's undemocratic, that it's not in the Constitution. The filibuster is not in the Constitution, by the way. It was an accidental incrustation going back to 1809 when Aaron Burr said, well, we don't need what's it called when you cut off debate? Moving the question. We don't need that because we're all gentlemen here, which they all were at that time, and we won't abuse that process. Well, it evolved into what we have now. Now, something happened in 1975. The filibuster, the rule was, and you hear about cloture. What the rule is to cut off debate. The idea is unlimited debate. That's the principle. So, until 1975, under the Senate rules, in order to cut off debate, you needed 2/3, 67 votes. And that really was practically impossible. So there was a huge fight. There was a lot of brinksmanship and arguing, and people, Ted Kennedy and Joe Biden and Birch Bayh and a lot of these people, and they made a deal. And they lowered it to 60 votes from 67, but they made it totally easy to do. I don't know if anybody ever has seen Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, but that's the popular image of a filibuster, is the guy standing, now 20%, 22% I think of the senator now women, but a senator standing at their desk and talking into the night, holding the floor, unlimited debate. After 1975, you don't have to do that anymore. You have to call Mitch McConnell or Chuck Schumer and say, I filibuster, I object. 60 votes. That's it. No work. You don't have to be there even. And by the way, you don't even have to be there to vote, because the burden is on the majority to get 60 votes. If none of the minorities show up, it doesn't matter, because if the majority gets 59 and the minority gets 2, they're all off on the beach, you don't get cloture. The bill is dead. And so I just made a pretty good case for getting rid of the filibuster. Here's the problem. When I got there, I fell into friendship with a guy named Carl Levin, who was a senior senator from Michigan, one of the most wonderful people I've ever met. And I spent some time with him, traveled in the Middle East with him, and he said, be careful what you wish for. Because once it's gone, it's gone. And today's obnoxious obstruction is tomorrow's priceless shield. Do you see what I mean? Things can change. Right now, the Democrats feel, God, we got to overcome these terrible Republican filibusters. 2 years from now, or 4 years, or 6 years from now, you could have a Republican president and a Republican Senate, and they could do some pretty terrible things, I think, or Chuck Schumer thinks, but you wouldn't, if there's filibusters going, you can't defend yourself. Do you see what I'm saying? It's a dangerous precedent, and here's why. In 2013, Mitch McConnell was blocking all of Obama's court nominees. Couldn't get anybody through, particularly for the appellate courts, the court between the district court and the Supreme Court. No appellate courts. He was blocking them all with the filibuster. Harry Reid, who was then the Democratic leader, finally had just had it. And so he persuaded the Democratic caucus plus me and Bernie Sanders. By the way, when Bernie ran for president, he had to sign up as a Democrat. My caucus fell in half, but I became the chair. So it wasn't all bad. So we voted, we changed the rules. The rule to change the rules is it takes 2/3. But there is a way you can do it, and I won't bore you with a simple majority. It's called the nuclear option, because it's considered so unacceptable. But we use the nuclear option to change the rules just a bit so that appellate and district court judges could be improved by a simple majority. That's it. Supreme Court, this was left, cabinet, all the same. It was all like that. Okay, flash forward 3 years, Republicans take over. First thing Mitch McConnell did was change the rule for Supreme Court judges, and we have Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett, none of whom would have been approved under the old rules. So my point is, this is not an easy decision. And I came down in favor not of abolishing it, but by going back to what's called a talking filibuster, where people would actually have to come and hold the floor and talk until they were exhausted, and then we could move on for voting rights this winter. To me, that was so fundamental. It was different than a policy issue of immigration or gun control. It was fundamental to the operation of the system. And I was convinced, and I spent, Tim Kaine and John Tester and I spent months with Joe Manchin trying to get him to the point where we could make that change. And ultimately, we couldn't do it. Joe wouldn't do it. He comes from West Virginia, which is where Robert Byrd, the senior rules guy in the Senate was, and Joe just wasn't going to make that change. So the point I want to make is, it's not as easy. You got to be careful. It's really easy to say, we got to get rid of the filibuster. Once it's gone, and then we're in a simple majority situation on everything, and things could happen that we don't like. On the other hand, I can argue, that's democracy, but it's something, the point I'm making is it's not a simple decision. Number 6, I told Mary this, and she looked at me like I was crazy. One of the things is, it really matters who the president is. Now, that seems pretty obvious, but what I mean is, and I came to this conclusion when Obama was president, I've served under Obama, Trump, and now Biden, in ways that you don't even know about. The head of the FCC, the Undersecretary of State for Mideast Policy, these kinds of appointments and positions and executive orders turn out to be really important, and much more so. Everybody, of course, it's obvious it's important who the president is in a large sense. But what I'm saying is, there is a day-to-day thing, who the appointees are, who the judges are. The judges that Donald Trump appointed are going to be there for 30, 40 years. And they're going to be in the court system for 30 or 40 years. And the same thing, of course, with Joe Biden. But the point is that there are powers that you don't really think about publicly, but that are really important as to who the president is. See, number 6, we're already halfway through. Okay? Number 7, where's Gail? Gail's in the back. Staff matters a lot. Nobody can do a job like this without really good people around them. You just can't. It's just too complicated. I have about literally 7 or 8 or 9, 10 meetings a day, hearings on nuclear policy, and then one on energy policy, and then something, and then I have to vote on a bill about immigration, and then I have to discuss amendments on some other. You got to have people around you who can help you and who you can trust to give you good advice. Now here's how way the staff works. There are about, my total staff is about 45, 30 in Washington, 15 up here. The 30 in Washington are mostly policy. They read, they study, they send me articles, they advise me, they say this is the amendment that's coming up here, the pros and cons, here's how it came out of committee. But the other thing that I've learned is the staff, particularly the policy staff, are your little ambassadors. If you want to get something done, it starts with the staff. I'll have an idea. I want to do something on, here's a good example. John Cornyn and I came up with an idea that one of the problems with the sanctions on Russia, and by the way, did you hear I said John Cornyn? You got to work with people, even though you might disagree with them 80% of the time. If you can agree with them 20% of the time, you got to do it. Cornyn is a very influential Republican senator, and if he and I can do something together, and it's good for the country, that's the way it ought to work. And sometimes people say, why are, like Mary joking about, why are you talking to Ted Cruz? There may be opportunities to get something done on a bipartisan basis. It has to start with reaching out. So anyway, Cornyn and I came to a realization, we were both on the Intelligence Committee, that one of the gaps in the sanctions against Russia was gold. The Russians have about $160 billion worth of gold that they were dribbling out to finance the war. And so we developed a bill to sanction the gold, to say you can't trade in Russian gold. And, but we had the idea, then we talked to staff. They turned it into a bill, to an amendment, to legal language. They work with the Council of the Senate, they work with the Department of the Treasury, and then they become little ambassadors to other senators. I send Alex Porter to talk to Tim Kaine's person and persuade them so they can persuade Tim, and on like that. So staff is really, really important. And staff, in my view, you have to have staff that tells you when you're wrong. When you're wrong. You've got to have people, and you've got to empower them affirmatively to tell you when you're wrong, because the higher up you are, I've got this big office, the ceiling is almost this high, it's ridiculous. But it's intimidating. And it's human nature to tell the boss what they want to hear, right? I mean, that's just human nature. So you have to, about once every 2 weeks, say, you gotta give me the straight thing here, because I'll go off and make big mistakes. I have a friend that has a sign in his office that says, if you and I agree all the time, one of us isn't necessary. That's a pretty profound observation, isn't it? And the other sign that Chinbro has in their conference room up in Pittsfield says, all of us are always smarter than any of us. I like that too, because you want the wisdom of the group, but you're not going to get the wisdom of the group unless you empower them, unless you tell them, and not just accept, they tell the truth, but you got to say, you got to tell me the truth. In other words, it's got to be an affirmative act. So staff is really, really important. Number 8. Here's one of the things about the Senate that I've noticed from now and what it was like in the 70s. There's too much power in the leaders. In the 70s, the power in the Senate was in the chairs of the committees. They called them the barons of Capitol Hill. Now the leaders have these powers that were always there but weren't really exercised. One of them is called Rule 14. Rule 14 enables the leader, the majority leader, to bring a bill to the floor with no hearing, no committee consideration, no nothing. It just goes to the floor and gets a vote. And that's become almost the norm. And it bypasses the whole process. I don't think that's right. I don't think that's good. I don't think that's good for the process, because you get these bills and then you got to vote them up or down, and there's no chance to monkey around with them and try to fix them. And what's happened is, as I see it, the power has sort of oozed from the committees to the leaders. And this business, remember I said about the lunches? I think part of that, they want us to be a part. They don't like us talking to each other, because it threatens the leadership, that the power that the leader has. But that's one of my observations. And but then the other thing is, the Senate does a lot by unanimous consent. Is there any other organization in the world that would run itself with a committee of 100, any one of whom could stop any decision? How long would General Motors last running that way? Or this art center? Anybody? It's crazy. The problem with unanimous consent is it enables bad actors. I sat the other night, we had 4 or 5 hours of votes till 8 or 9 at night. There was a Mike Lee amendment that we voted on, and there was a Rand Paul amendment. Both of them got their amendments to the floor and got a vote because they were willing to just block everything unless that happened. And I leaned over to Maggie Hassan, who sits next to me, and said, you realize we're rewarding bad behavior here. And yet that's become, the Senate rules enabled that kind of thing, but historically people didn't take advantage of it. Do you see what I mean? You had a liberal, open rule, but there was a kind of restraint and a respect and that kind of thing, a lot of that is gone now. And if you're willing to bear a little bit of bad will from your colleagues, you know, you get a lot more than if you color within the lines. And I don't think that's a good system. My view is we ought to change the rules, and unanimous means 95%, not unanimous. It ought to take more than one person. Hawley from Missouri, Senator Hawley, Josh Hawley, is blocking every nominee for the Department of Defense, every one. He's blocking them from getting a vote because he's mad at the way the Secretary of Defense handled the exit from Afghanistan. I'm not going to let anybody go through until General Austin resigns. Do you realize what that does to national security? I mean, we don't have the people in the jobs in the Pentagon that we should have. By the way, I flew to California to see Duncan's daughter get her bat mitzvah last year, my son, and there was a kid that got on the plane with a T-shirt with big letters. It said, "Dear America, we're sorry for Josh Hawley. Yours, Missouri." I have a picture of it. But the point is, one person shouldn't be able to do that. I mean, that's just not right. So, you know, we're going to be talking about the rules this winter, and between after the election, before the new Congress. In fact, we ought to do it. We probably will be doing it before the election, so nobody knows how it's going to come out, and try to change some of these rules so one person can't do those kinds of things. Let's see. Number 9. The divisions in the Senate reflect the divisions in the country. It's not the Senate that's divided, it's the country that's divided. And I've thought a lot about this, and my experience has been, going back to being governor, that if you have a complicated issue and you can get 15 or 20 people sitting around a table and get agreement on the facts, Mary, you know what I'm talking about. You get agreement on the facts, the policy becomes pretty easy. Everybody shares the same facts, then what you do about it becomes almost self-evident. Here's the problem. We have people in this country living in different factual universes. They are just, I'll never forget going to a forum just before the 2016 election and listening to a couple of reporters who had been following Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. And one of them, I thought, had one of the best insights about that election I've heard before or since. She said, these two people are running for president of two different countries. I thought that was a really important insight. Now, when I was young, we had pretty much shared facts because we all got our information from one person. Who was it? Isn't it amazing? Everybody says that. Walter Cronkite. Now, the combination of what I call the balkanization of the news business, and then there's a concept called confirmation bias, where human nature is to seek out sources of information that you already agree with. You put those two things together, and if you're liberal, you watch MSNBC. People are now going through Rachel Maddow withdrawal all over the country. It's, you know, my sister shakes at 9 o'clock at night. Or you watch Fox News. And the people who do those, you know, who that's their information, they have entirely different views of what's going on. Here's a perfect example. Before the State of the Union speech, where the president comes, there's always an informal sort of buffet dinner of senators and one guest. You can bring one guest. And it's you know, it's very informal, round tables. You go through the line, you get your dinner, and you sit with whoever. You know, it's not a fancy dinner at all. So one of the State of the Unions, I think my guest was Kathy Leonard, who runs a business up in Auburn. Some of you may know her. Anyway, we sat down with Martin Heinrich of New Mexico. His guest was a young woman who was the Teacher of the Year in New Mexico. Makes sense, Teacher of the Year. She was a dreamer. She was an illegal immigrant. Flash forward a half hour and you've got Trump talking about MS-13 and rapists and killers. If your factual view of immigrants are rapists and killers versus Teachers of the Year, how the heck do you ever think you're going to arrive at a consensus about what to do about immigration? And that's a real problem. And then you add to that the tyranny of the algorithm. And we've all experienced this, where if you click on something, you get deluged with it. Wayfair is convinced I want some wall sconces. You know? But that's okay. What I said to somebody the other day, I don't mind if they use the algorithm to sell me stuff. I don't like it when they use it to sell me ideas. And the problem is, you click on something about, Hillary Clinton, and you're going to be deluged with garbage about Hillary Clinton, or something about Donald Trump, is crooked in New York or something. In other words, it becomes self-feeding and pulls us further and further apart. I don't have an answer for that, except we've got to teach kids how to use the internet. Thank you. When we did the laptop project back in 20 years ago, by the way, it's still going. It's really amazing. I was on with them yesterday morning. We promoted something called digital literacy, and it sort of got lost. But we've got to teach people how to use the internet and discern fact from fiction, how to tell when somebody's conning you, how to look for various points of view, because that's the only answer. In a country with the First Amendment and freedom of speech, we can't censor. I don't want to do that. But we've got to be better consumers of information. I really think that's one of the answers. One other point on this, almost done, finally. Mary says I say finally too much. It gets people's hopes up. The tyranny of the primary. In a state that's a red state or a blue state, and that's the way they seem to break down. Maine is blessedly kind of, a little mixture, right? Purple, they say. But if you're from Oklahoma, the Republican primary is the election. Okay? Democratic primary doesn't matter. Because whoever the Republican candidate is going to win the election. Who votes in a Republican primary or a Democratic primary in a blue state? The activists. The furthest to the left or the furthest to the right. And so in the primary, you tend to get candidates who cater to the edge of their party. That's the direction that we're going in. I have a graph in the phone. 25 or 30 years ago, there was an overlap in the House of about 100 members who overlapped ideologically, more conservative, more liberal, between the parties. Now there are 11. In the Senate, there are 0. Susan Collins is probably the most moderate Republican in terms of her voting record. Joe Manchin's the most conservative Democrat, but there's still gap. There's still air between them. By the way, some national group ranked me, I'm 48th most liberal or 52nd most conservative. That's okay. I like that. But the problem is, and here's what really worries me, and I'm going to share a thought with you that I haven't seen anywhere, I haven't read anywhere, this is just my observation. We've gotten to a place in our politics where you can lose your election. Remember, in a state where the primary, or if you're a gerrymandered House district, where the primary is the election, you can lose the election not because of your position on abortion or gay rights or immigration or anything else, but because you're viewed as a person who's willing to listen to the other side and try to solve the problem. In other words, there's a penalty for being reasonable. There's a drastic penalty for compromising. What's the worst thing you can call a Republican right now? What's the worst thing that Donald Trump can call somebody? A rhino. And I read today there's now Dino, Democrat in name only. Out in Oregon there was an election named Dino. So if you fear your loss of your job because you're willing to talk to the other side. Do you realize how dangerous that is? Because all these complicated problems need to be compromised. I had dinner, and I'll end on this before my final number 10. Had dinner with a guy named Mike Enzi 5 or 6 years ago. Wonderful guy, very conservative Republican senator from Wyoming. He and I got to be pretty good friends. I was having dinner with him, and he mentioned that he thought he was going to have a primary in Wyoming. I said, Mike, you're one of the most conservative people here. How can anybody get to your right? What are they going to charge you with? And without missing a beat, he said, they're going to charge me with being reasonable. That is very dangerous for democracy. And that's something that really worries me, and I don't have a solution for it except what they do in Alaska, which is really cool. They're having a primary, I think in August. Anybody can run and anybody can vote. It's a true primary, but it's not a party primary. Anybody can vote. The top 4 vote getters in that primary go on to the election in November, and the election in November is ranked choice voting. Isn't that cool? And I think Lisa Murkowski is going to survive. She would never survive if she had to go through a Republican primary today, because she's reasonable. She's, in my view, has the highest level of integrity of anybody in the whole place. So we've got to figure out mechanical ways, and I think open primaries is one way to get away from this problem of the parties going to the extreme. Let me give you one little math example, and I'm not picking on Charlie because he and I have become really good friends. In 2012, when Charlie Summers was the Republican candidate, there are about 30% of Maine, and you could do this for the Democrats, I'm not picking on the Republicans, but about 30% of Maine people are Republicans. Okay. About 20% of the Republicans voted in the Republican primary. So that's 20% of 30% or 6%. Charlie won the primary with 35% of 6%. So the nominee for Republican candidate for the United States Senate was voted onto the ballot by 2% of the Maine people. It's hard to argue that that makes any sense. And the same thing goes on the Democratic side, and it's because of self-selection of who votes in primaries. So, final point, it's an amazing job. It's got to be one of the most engaging, interesting, and in my notes it says, and occasionally rewarding, because you do get to do something on a large scale that will make a real difference in people's lives. That infrastructure bill. I've been pounding the drum for broadband ever since I entered the Senate, but the first thing I wrote in the Press Herald in 2012, running for the Senate, was about broadband and rural electrification, and damned if we didn't do it in the bill that just passed. $500 million is going to come to Maine. Enough. And it's enough to wire the whole state. And make it affordable for people, particularly in rural areas, which is, that's the crucial infrastructure of the 21st century. So that feels good. The point I'm making is every now and then you get to do something that you feel is really important. At the same time, it couldn't be more interesting because every day is something different. I'm on the Armed Services and the Intelligence Committee. I've had fascinating, I had a briefing yesterday about something that I can't tell you. If I did, I'd have to kill you. But it was absolutely fascinating on sort of the intersection of intelligence and armed services. And I got to tell you, I bet you I have between 200 and 300 pictures of the U.S. Capitol in my phone. I can't walk into that building and not get chills and sort of pinch myself, particularly being a staff. I keep waiting for somebody to come up behind me and say, you can't be here. And they say, Senator, and I, who's this? But it is to be able to go to work every morning in the United States Capitol, and particularly to come out at night when we have a night session and see the dome lit against the night sky it reminds us of what this could and should be. I often post those pictures on Instagram, and I always say if only our work could match these surroundings. But every now and then it does, and that's when it really feels like you've done something for the people of Maine and the country. Thank you.